The wind cut through the streets of Chicago like a knife that December evening. It was the kind of cold that made your bones ache, the kind that reminded you just how fragile the human body really is. Most people hurried past with their collars turned up and their eyes fixed on the warm glow of restaurants and coffee shops. Nobody wanted to be outside longer than they had to be, but for 19-year-old Elena, there was no warm place waiting. There was no door to open, no heater to stand beside, no hot meal to look forward to. For her, the street was home now, and tonight, like every night for the past 3 months, she sat huddled against the brick wall of a fancy restaurant, watching life happen around her, while she slowly disappeared. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders, but it didn't help much. The jacket had been her mother's. It was old and worn, with a small tear near the pocket that she kept meaning to fix but never did. She couldn't bring herself to throw it away. It still smelled like her mother sometimes, especially when the rain hit it. That smell was all she had left. Well, that and the violin. The battered case sat beside her on the cold sidewalk. It was scratched and dented, held together by tape in some places, but inside, wrapped in a piece of cloth that used to be a nice scarf, was the only treasure Elena still owned. Her mother's violin. The same violin her mother had played since she was a young girl in a small village overseas. The same violin that had filled their tiny apartment with music every single night, no matter how hard life got. Elena hadn't touched it in weeks. She couldn't. Every time she opened that case, she saw her mother's hands instead of her own. She heard her mother's voice saying, "Music is how we talk to heaven, my love." When words fail, the violin speaks, but her mother was gone now. And Elena wasn't sure heaven was listening anymore. 2 years ago, everything had been different. Elena was a student at one of the best music schools in the city. Her teachers said she had a gift, that her playing made people feel things they couldn't explain. She had dreams of performing on big stages, of traveling the world, of making her mother proud. Her mother had worked 2 jobs to pay for those lessons. She cleaned offices at night and worked at a laundromat during the day. Her hands were always rough and tired, but she never complained. She would come home exhausted, kick off her shoes, and say, "Play something for me, Elena. Make me forget how much my feet hurt." And Elena would play. She would play until her mother fell asleep on the couch, with a smile on her face. Those were the best moments of her life. Then came the diagnosis. It started with a cough that wouldn't go away. Then came the fatigue, the weight loss, the doctor's visits that got longer and more serious. By the time they found the cancer, it had already spread too far. Elena dropped out of school immediately. There was no other choice. She needed to take care of her mother, and she needed to work to help pay the medical bills. She got a job at a grocery store, stacking shelves and working the register. She sold most of her things. She stopped playing music altogether because there simply wasn't time. For 8 months, she watched her mother fade. She held her hand through chemotherapy sessions that made her too weak to stand. She stayed up all night when the pain got too bad. She learned how to give injections and change bandages and pretend to be strong when she felt like falling apart. Her mother tried to stay positive until the very end. Even in her final days, when speaking took all her energy, she would whisper, "Promise me you'll keep playing. Promise me you won't let the music die." Elena promised. She held her mother's hand and swore she would never stop playing. 3 days later, her mother was gone. The funeral was small, just a few neighbors and some people from the laundromat where her mother had worked. Elena stood there, in her only black dress, feeling like a ghost herself. She didn't cry. She couldn't. It was like all the tears had frozen inside her. After the funeral came the bills. Medical debt piled up like a mountain she could never climb. The apartment they had shared for 15 years was too expensive to keep. She tried to work more hours, tried to find a second job, tried everything she could think of. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Within 4 months, Elena lost the apartment. She packed what little she could carry into a single bag and walked out of the only home she had ever known. She left behind her mother's favorite chair, the kitchen table where they had shared thousands of meals, The window where her mother used to sit and watch the sunset. But she took the violin. She would have slept on the street forever before letting go of that violin. And now here she was. 19 years old, alone in the world, sitting on a frozen sidewalk, while rich people walked past her like she didn't exist. She had tried shelters, but they were always full. She had tried to find work, but nobody wanted to hire a girl with no address and no phone number. She had tried asking for help, but most people looked away the moment they saw her. The hardest part wasn't the cold. It wasn't even the hunger. Though she hadn't eaten in 2 days, and her stomach had stopped growling hours ago, because there was nothing left to growl for. The hardest part was being invisible. She would look into people's eyes, hoping for just a moment of connection, but they would look right through her like she was made of glass. She had become a ghost, just like she feared at her mother's funeral. Tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the cold finally getting to her brain. Maybe it was the hunger making her desperate. Or maybe it was the sound of laughter coming from inside the restaurant, where people were celebrating and eating and living, while she sat outside wondering if she would survive until morning. She looked at the violin case beside her. She hadn't opened it in so long. She was afraid to. Afraid that she had forgotten how to play. Afraid that the music would remind her too much of everything she had lost. Afraid that her mother's spirit lived inside that instrument and would be disappointed in what her daughter had become. But what did she have left to lose? With trembling hands, Elena reached for the case. The latches were cold and stiff, but they clicked open like they had been waiting for her. Inside, the violin lay there like an old friend. Even in the dim streetlight, she could see the warm glow of the wood, the delicate curve of the neck, the strings that hadn't been played in months. She didn't take it out. Not yet. Instead, she reached for a piece of cardboard that had been sticking out of a nearby trash can. She found a marker in her bag, one she used to keep from her school days, and with shaking fingers, she wrote 5 words that would change her life forever. Please let me play for food. She didn't know it yet. But in just a few minutes, she would walk into that restaurant. She would face rejection and cruelty. She would be treated like she was worthless. But she would also discover that sometimes, when you have absolutely nothing left, that's exactly when miracles decide to show up. Elena closed the violin case, tucked the cardboard sign under her arm, and slowly rose to her feet. It was time to stop being invisible. Elena stood outside the restaurant for a long moment, just staring at the door. Through the frosted glass, she could see the warm golden light inside. She could hear the soft music playing, the gentle clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation. It was another world in there. A world where people had full stomachs and warm coats, and somewhere to go when the night was over. She looked down at her cardboard sign. The words she had written seemed so small now. So foolish. What was she thinking? A place like this would never let someone like her inside. She was dirty. Her clothes were wrinkled and worn. Her hair hadn't been properly washed in weeks. She probably smelled like the street. But her stomach cramped again, reminding her that she hadn't eaten in 2 days. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the fear and shame, a tiny voice whispered something her mother used to say. The worst they can say is no, my love. But what if they say yes? Elena took a deep breath. Then another. Then she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The warmth hit her first. It wrapped around her like a blanket, and for just a moment, she forgot why she was there. She forgot everything except how good it felt to be warm again. The restaurant was beautiful, with white tablecloths and candles on every table, and waiters in black vests moving gracefully between the guests. It smelled like roasted meat and fresh bread and something sweet baking in the kitchen. Her stomach twisted painfully. She had taken maybe 3 steps inside when a man appeared in front of her. He was tall and thin, wearing an expensive suit and a name tag that said, Manager. His face was the kind that looked like it had never smiled, with thin lips pressed together and eyes that scanned her from head to toe in less than a second. Elena knew that look. She had seen it many times in the past 3 months. It was the look people gave you when they had already decided you were worthless. Can I help you? The manager asked, but his tone made it clear he had no intention of helping at all. Elena opened her mouth, but the words got stuck. She held up her cardboard sign instead, her hands trembling slightly. The manager didn't even read it properly. He just glanced at it, and his face hardened even more. "We don't allow this here," he said, his voice low but sharp. "This is a respectable establishment. Our guests come here for a nice evening, not to be bothered by people begging for handouts." "I'm not begging," Elena managed to say. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "I just want to play. I have a violin. If people like it, maybe someone could spare some food. That's all. I won't ask for money. I just want to play one song." The manager looked at the violin case in her hand like it was something diseased. "I don't care if you have a full orchestra in that case. You need to leave. Now. You're making our guests uncomfortable." Elena looked past him at the dining room. Most people hadn't even noticed her yet. They were busy with their meals, their conversations, their perfect little evenings. She wasn't making anyone uncomfortable. She was just convenient to blame. "Please," she whispered. "I haven't eaten in 2 days. I'm not asking for charity. I want to earn it. Just let me play one song. 3 minutes. That's all I'm asking. If nobody likes it, I'll leave and never come back." For a split second, something flickered in the manager's eyes. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was doubt. But it disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by that cold, professional mask. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said, reaching for her arm. "If you don't go willingly, I'll have to call security." Elena felt her heart sink. This was it. She had tried. And she had failed. Just like she failed at everything else, since her mother died. She was about to turn around and walk back into the cold when a voice cut through the quiet murmur of the restaurant. "Wait." It wasn't a loud voice, but it carried a certain weight that made everyone stop. The manager froze with his hand still reaching toward Elena. A few nearby guests turned their heads to look. An elderly woman was rising from a table by the window. She moved slowly but with purpose, the way someone moves when they have lived long enough to stop rushing. Her hair was silver and pulled back in an elegant style, and she wore a simple dark dress with a string of pearls around her neck. But it was her eyes that caught Elena's attention. They were sharp and clear, the kind of eyes that missed nothing. "Let her play," the woman said. The manager's professional smile faltered. "Mrs. Chen, I appreciate your concern, but this is not the kind of entertainment we offer here. This girl is clearly..." "Clearly what?" Mrs. Chen interrupted. Her voice was soft but firm. "Clearly hungry? Clearly cold? Clearly desperate enough to walk into a place like this and ask strangers for a chance?" The manager had no answer for that. Mrs. Chen walked closer, and Elena noticed that the other guests were watching now. The whole restaurant had gone quiet, sensing that something unusual was happening. "I have been coming to this restaurant for 15 years, Mrs. Chen continued. "I have spent more money here than I care to count. I have never once asked for a special favor. But I am asking now. Let this girl play one song. 3 minutes of your time. Is that really too much to ask?" The manager looked uncomfortable. He glanced around at the watching guests, clearly calculating the cost of refusing a loyal customer versus the cost of letting a homeless girl perform. "Mrs. Chen, with all due respect, we have standards to maintain. We can't just let anyone walk in off the street and..." "One song," Mrs. Chen said again. "If nobody wants to hear it, she leaves quietly. But if I'm right about what I see in this girl's eyes, you might be about to witness something you'll remember for the rest of your life." Elena stared at the old woman. Nobody had looked at her like that in months. Like she was a person. Like she mattered. Like she might still have something valuable to offer the world. The manager sighed heavily. He was defeated, and he knew it. Refusing Mrs. Chen in front of all these witnesses would be worse for business than letting some street girl play a quick song. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "One song. 3 minutes. Then she leaves. Whether anyone likes it or not." Mrs. Chen smiled slightly and nodded. Then she turned to Elena and looked her directly in the eyes. "What's your name, dear?" "Elena," she whispered. "Elena," Mrs. Chen repeated, as if tasting the word. That's a beautiful name. It means light. Did you know that? Elena nodded. Her mother had told her that story 100 times. Well then, Elena, Mrs. Chen said gently, why don't you show these people your light? Elena's hands were shaking as she knelt down to open the violin case. She could feel every eye in the restaurant on her. She could hear the whispers, some curious, some annoyed, some pitying. The manager stood off to the side with his arms crossed, already counting down the seconds until he could throw her out. But none of that mattered anymore, because when Elena lifted her mother's violin out of that worn case, something shifted inside her. The wood felt warm against her fingers, familiar and safe. She raised it to her shoulder and felt the old muscle memory kick in, her body remembering what her mind had tried to forget. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, Elena remembered who she used to be. She took one deep breath, placed the bow against the strings, and began to play. What happened next would change everything. Not just for Elena, but for everyone in that restaurant, including the old woman who had given her a chance, and the manager who had tried to throw her away. Because some moments in life are so powerful, so unexpected, so full of raw truth, that they crack open the hearts of everyone who witnesses them. This was about to be one of those moments. The first note hung in the air like a question. It was soft, almost fragile, like Elena herself. A few people in the restaurant shifted in their seats, unsure what to expect. Some looked annoyed, already preparing their complaints for later. Others watched with mild curiosity, the way you might watch a street performer you don't really care about. But then the second note came, and the third, and something started to change. Elena had chosen to play a piece called Meditation from Thais. It was a song her mother had taught her many years ago, on a rainy afternoon when the power had gone out and they had nothing to do but make music together. Her mother had said it was one of the most beautiful melodies ever written, a song about longing and hope and the quiet ache of loving someone you can never hold again. Back then, Elena had played it because it was pretty. Now, she played it because she finally understood what it meant. Her eyes stayed closed as the melody began to build. She didn't see the restaurant anymore. She didn't see the expensive decorations or the fancy guests or the manager standing in the corner with his arms crossed. In her mind, she was somewhere else entirely. She was back in their tiny apartment, sitting on the old couch with the broken spring. Her mother was beside her, humming along to the music, her eyes closed, and a peaceful smile on her face. The afternoon light was coming through the window, turning everything golden. They didn't have much, but they had each other. And that was enough. Elena poured that memory into the music. Every note became a word she never got to say. Every phrase became a goodbye she wasn't ready to give. The restaurant had gone completely silent now, not the polite silence of people waiting for something to end. This was different. This was the silence of people who had suddenly forgotten where they were. Forks had stopped moving. Conversations had died mid-sentence. Even the waiters had frozen in place. Trays balanced on their hands, their eyes fixed on the thin girl with the scratched violin. A woman at a nearby table put her hand over her mouth. Her husband reached for her other hand and held it tightly. They didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. At another table, a businessman who had been checking his phone all evening slowly put it down. He stared at Elena like he was seeing something he had lost a long time ago. His eyes grew wet, but he didn't wipe them. He just let the tears come. The music grew stronger now, rising and falling like waves on an ocean. Elena's bow moved across the strings, with a power that seemed impossible for someone so small, so hungry, so broken. But that was the thing about music. It didn't care how weak your body was, it only cared how full your heart was. And Elena's heart was overflowing. She thought about all the nights she had stayed awake holding her mother's hand in the hospital. She thought about the promises she had made that she couldn't keep. She thought about the day she had to pack up their apartment and leave behind everything that mattered. She thought about the cold streets and the empty stomach and the way people looked through her like she was made of air. All of that pain, all of that grief, all of that love, with nowhere left to go. It all came pouring out through her fingers and into the violin. Mrs. Chen, The elderly woman who had spoken up for her sat absolutely still at her table by the window. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and her eyes never left Elena's face. Something about the way this girl played felt familiar. Not just the technique, which was remarkable, but something deeper. Something in the phrasing, in the way she let certain notes linger just a moment longer than expected. It reminded her of someone she used to know, but that was impossible. That person had disappeared over 20 years ago. The melody reached its highest point, a single note that seemed to hang in the air forever, suspended between heaven and earth. Elena held it there, her whole body trembling with the effort, with the emotion, with everything she had been holding inside for so long. Then, slowly, gently, the music began to descend. The notes grew softer, more tender, like a mother singing her child to sleep, like a final whisper between two people who know they will never see each other again. Elena played the last phrase with her eyes still closed, tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't even realize she was crying until she felt the wetness on her chin. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The music had taken over, and she was just along for the ride. The final note faded into silence. For a moment, nobody moved. The whole restaurant seemed frozen in time, caught in the space between the last note and whatever came next. It was as if the music had cast a spell over everyone, and nobody wanted to be the first to break it. Then Mrs. Chen rose from her chair. She stood there for a moment, her eyes glistening with tears she made no effort to hide. Then she brought her hands together, in a single, clear clap. That sound broke the spell. Suddenly, the whole restaurant erupted. People began to clap, slowly at first, then faster, louder, until the applause filled every corner of the room. Chairs scraped against the floor as guests stood up, one after another, until nearly everyone in the restaurant was on their feet. Some were crying openly, others were shaking their heads in disbelief, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Elena finally opened her eyes, and what she saw took her breath away. These people, these strangers, who had ignored her on the street, who had walked past her like she didn't exist, they were standing for her. They were crying for her. They were looking at her not with pity or disgust, but with something that looked almost like awe. She didn't know what to do. She had never experienced anything like this before. Even in her best days at the music school, she had never received a reaction like this. She just stood there, clutching her mother's violin, tears still running down her face, completely overwhelmed. The manager was standing in the same spot where he had tried to throw her out just minutes ago. But he looked different now. The coldness in his eyes had melted into something else. Shock. Maybe. Or shame. He uncrossed his arms and let them hang at his sides, suddenly unsure what to do with himself. Mrs. Chen walked toward Elena, moving through the crowd of standing guests like a ship cutting through still water. When she reached the girl, she stopped and looked at her for a long moment. "That was beautiful," she said softly. But there was something else in her voice now. Something beyond simple admiration. It sounded almost like recognition. "Thank you," Elena whispered. Her voice was hoarse from crying. "Thank you for letting me play." Mrs. Chen shook her head slowly. "No, child. Thank you for reminding me why music matters." She reached out and gently touched Elena's hand, the one still holding the violin. Her fingers brushed against the worn wood, tracing the scratches and dents like she was reading a story written in scars. "This violin," Mrs. Chen said quietly, "it has a beautiful tone. Very old, very special. Where did you get it?" Elena looked down at the instrument in her hands. "It was my mother's. She taught me everything I know. She died almost a year ago." Mrs. Chen's face changed. Something flickered behind her eyes. A spark of something that could have been hope, or fear, or both. "Your mother," she said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper now. "What was her name?" Elena looked up at the old woman, confused by the sudden intensity in her eyes. "Her name was Anna," she said. "Anna Vasquez." The color drained from Mrs. Chen's face. She took a step back, her hand flying to her chest as if she had just been struck. For a moment, she looked like she might fall, and Elena instinctively reached out to steady her. "Mrs. Chen, are you okay? What's wrong?" But Mrs. Chen couldn't speak. She just stared at Elena with wide, trembling eyes, like she was seeing a ghost, because in a way, she was. Mrs. Chen's legs felt weak beneath her. She gripped the edge of a nearby table to keep herself steady, her eyes never leaving Elena's face. Now that she was looking properly, really looking, she could see it. The shape of the eyes, the curve of the chin, the way she held her head slightly tilted when she was confused. It was like looking at a photograph from 30 years ago. "Ana Vasquez." Mrs. Chen repeated the name slowly, like she was afraid it might break if she said it too fast. "Your mother was Ana Vasquez." Elena nodded, growing more worried by the second. "Yes. Did you know her? Are you all right? Should I call someone?" The restaurant had grown quiet again, but for a different reason now. The guests who had been applauding moments ago were watching this strange scene unfold, sensing that something important was happening but not understanding what. Mrs. Chen took a deep breath and steadied herself. When she spoke again, her voice was trembling but clear. "I knew your mother," she said. "I knew her very well. A long time ago. Before you were born. She was my student." Elena felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Your student? But my mother never mentioned. She never told me about any teacher named Chen." "She wouldn't have," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "When she left, she wanted to leave everything behind, including me, including the life she had before." The old woman gestured toward her table by the window. "Please, sit with me. I think there are things you need to hear, things about your mother that perhaps she never had the chance to tell you." Elena hesitated. Part of her wanted to run, to escape back into the cold night where things made sense, where she was just a homeless girl, with nothing and nobody. This was too much, too strange, too sudden. But another part of her, the part that still ached for her mother every single day, needed to know more. She followed Mrs. Chen to the table and sat down across from her. A waiter appeared almost immediately, placing a glass of water in front of Elena and a cup of tea in front of Mrs. Chen. The manager was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps he had retreated to his office, embarrassed by how wrong he had been. Mrs. Chen wrapped her hands around her teacup but didn't drink. She stared at the steam rising from it, gathering her thoughts. 32 years ago, she began. "I was a professor at the conservatory. I had taught many talented students over the years, but none of them compared to the girl who walked into my studio one autumn afternoon. She was 17 years old, fresh from a small village overseas, with barely any money and almost no formal training. But when she played..." Mrs. Chen paused, her eyes growing distant with memory. "When she played, it was like hearing the voice of God." Elena felt tears pricking at her eyes again. That sounded exactly like her mother. "Her name was Ana," Mrs. Chen continued. "Ana Vasquez. And she became the most gifted student I ever taught. For 3 years, I poured everything I had into her. I gave her private lessons, helped her find scholarships, introduced her to important people in the music world. Everyone who heard her play said the same thing. This girl was going to be a star. She was going to perform on the greatest stages in the world." Mrs. Chen's voice grew heavier now, weighed down by old sadness. But then, something happened. In her final year, Anna fell in love with a young man. He was kind and good, but he had no connection to the music world. He worked with his hands, building things, fixing things. He didn't understand why Anna practiced for 8 hours a day. He didn't understand why music mattered more to her than sleep or food or anything else. Elena's heart clenched. She knew who Mrs. Chen was talking about. Her father, the man who had left when Elena was just 3 years old. The man her mother rarely spoke about. "I warned her, Mrs. Chen said, and there was pain in her voice. "I told her she had to choose. A career like the one she was building. It demanded everything. There was no room for distractions, no room for a life outside the music. I was harsh. Too harsh. probably. I gave her an ultimatum. The music? Or him? She looked up at Elena, and there were tears on her weathered cheeks now. She chose him. She walked out of my studio that day, and never came back. She gave up everything. Her scholarship, her career, her future, all for love. And I was so angry, so hurt, that I never went after her. I let her go. I told myself she had made her choice, and she would have to live with it. Mrs. Chen's voice broke. I never saw her again. I never knew what happened to her. For 30 years, I wondered. I hoped she was happy. I prayed she was still playing somewhere, even if it wasn't on the stages I had dreamed of for her. But I never knew. Until tonight. Elena was crying now, tears falling silently down her cheeks. All those years, her mother had carried this secret. All those years, she had hidden this entire chapter of her life, never telling Elena about the conservatory, about Mrs. Chen, about the brilliant future she had walked away from. She was happy, Elena whispered. Maybe not the way you imagined, but she was happy. She had me. She had her violin. She played every single night, even when she was exhausted from working 2 jobs. She used to say that music was how we talked to heaven. Mrs. Chen let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I taught her that, those exact words. I told her that on the first day we met. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The restaurant noise had faded to a distant hum. It was like they existed in their own little bubble, connected by a woman they had both loved in different ways. Why didn't she tell me? Elena finally asked. Why did she keep all of this a secret? Mrs. Chen shook her head slowly. I think I know. Your mother was proud. Maybe too proud. She didn't want you to know what she had given up. She didn't want you to feel like you were the reason she never became what she could have been. She wanted you to see her as she was, not as she might have been. Elena thought about all the nights her mother had sat by the window, staring at nothing, a faraway look in her eyes. She had always assumed her mother was just tired. Now she understood. Her mother had been remembering, grieving for a life that could have been. She never regretted it, Elena said firmly. She told me that. Many times. She said I was the best thing that ever happened to her. Mrs. Chen reached across the table and took Elena's hand. Her fingers were thin and cool, but her grip was surprisingly strong. And she was right, Mrs. Chen said. Because if she had stayed with me, if she had become the star I wanted her to be, you would never have been born, and the world would have lost something far more precious than a famous violinist. Elena looked down at their joined hands. This woman, this stranger who had known her mother before Elena even existed, was looking at her like she was something valuable, something worth saving. What happened to my father? Elena asked suddenly. It was something she had always wondered but never dared to ask her mother. Mrs. Chen's expression grew complicated. I don't know everything. But I heard rumors over the years. The marriage fell apart when you were very young. He left. Anna raised you alone. Elena nodded. That matched what little she knew. Her father had simply vanished one day, leaving behind nothing but a closet full of empty hangers and a mother who cried quietly when she thought Elena was asleep. She did everything for me, Elena said. She worked herself to exhaustion. She never bought anything for herself. Every extra penny went toward my music lessons. And when she got sick, she couldn't finish the sentence. The grief was still too fresh. Even after all these months, Mrs. Chen squeezed her hand tighter. You don't have to explain. I can see it in your eyes. You loved her. She loved you. That's all that matters. They sat in silence for another moment. Then Mrs. Chen straightened up, and something in her expression changed. The grief was still there, but now there was something else too. Determination. Elena, she said, what are your plans? What are you going to do now? Elena almost laughed. Plans? She didn't have plans. She didn't even know where she was going to sleep tonight. I don't have any plans, she admitted. I've been living on the street for 3 months. I have nowhere to go. No money, no job, nothing except this violin and the clothes on my back." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly, as if this was exactly what she had expected to hear. "Then let me ask you something else," she said. "If you could do anything, if money and circumstances were not obstacles, what would you want to do with your life?" Elena didn't even have to think about it. The answer had lived inside her for as long as she could remember. "I would play," she said simply. "I would play music for the rest of my life. It's the only thing I've ever wanted. The only thing I'm good at. The only thing that makes me feel like my mother is still with me." Mrs. Chen smiled, and for the first time that evening, it was a real smile, full of warmth and hope, and something that looked almost like purpose. "Then that's exactly what you're going to do," she said. "Because I failed your mother 30 years ago. I let her walk away when I should have fought for her. I am not going to make the same mistake with her daughter." Elena stared at her, not understanding. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Chen stood up from the table, still holding Elena's hand. "I mean that tonight, you're coming home with me. Tomorrow, we start working on the rest of your life. I still have connections in the music world. I still have friends at the conservatory. And most importantly, I still have ears. And what I heard tonight was not just talent, Elena. It was something rare, something extraordinary, something that deserves a chance to be heard by the world." Elena felt dizzy. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. You didn't just go from sleeping on the street to being offered a new life by a stranger. But then she remembered something her mother had told her once, on a night when everything seemed hopeless. "Sometimes," her mother had said, "angels don't have wings. They have wrinkled hands and tired eyes, and hearts full of love they've been saving for the right person. You just have to recognize them when they appear." Elena looked at Mrs. Chen, at her wrinkled hands and tired eyes, and the love that radiated from her like warmth from a fire. Maybe her mother had been right. Maybe this was her angel. 6 months can change everything. Elena stood backstage at the Chicago Symphony Hall, her hands trembling slightly as she held her mother's violin. The instrument had been restored now. The scratches smoothed away, the old strings replaced with new ones that sang like birds in springtime, but it was still the same violin, still her mother's, still the bridge that connected her to everything she had lost and everything she had found. Through the heavy curtain, she could hear the murmur of the audience. 2,000 people had come tonight, filling every seat in the grand hall. Critics from major newspapers sat in the front rows with their notebooks ready. Music students had traveled from across the country just to hear her play. And somewhere out there, in a special seat reserved just for her, sat Mrs. Chen. Elena closed her eyes and thought about the past 6 months. It felt like a dream, the kind you're afraid to wake up from, because reality could never be this good. That first night, after Mrs. Chen had taken her home, Elena had been too overwhelmed to sleep. She had sat in the guest bedroom of Mrs. Chen's beautiful apartment, staring at the clean sheets and soft pillows, unable to believe any of it was real. She kept waiting for someone to shake her awake and tell her she was still on the street, still cold, still hungry, still alone. But morning came, and she was still there. Mrs. Chen made her breakfast, eggs and toast and fresh fruit, more food than Elena had seen in months. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, tears rolling down her cheeks because she had forgotten what it felt like to have a full stomach. The first few weeks were hard. Elena had to learn how to be a person again, how to sleep in a bed, how to take hot showers, how to sit at a table and eat meals at regular times. Her body had grown so used to survival mode that it didn't know how to relax. But Mrs. Chen was patient. She never pushed too hard or expected too much. She let Elena rest when she needed to rest, cry when she needed to cry, and be silent when words felt too heavy. She treated Elena not like a charity case, but like family. When Elena was ready, the real work began. Mrs. Chen still had connections everywhere in the music world. She made phone calls, wrote letters, called in favors she had been saving for decades. Within a month, Elena was enrolled in a special program at the conservatory. the same school where her mother had studied all those years ago. She was given a full scholarship, plus a small living allowance, so she wouldn't have to worry about money while she focused on her music. The other students didn't know what to make of her at first. Some of them had heard rumors about where she came from, and they looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and doubt. But every time Elena picked up her violin, the whispers stopped. Her playing spoke louder than any gossip ever could. Her teachers were amazed by her progress. She had natural talent, yes, but she also had something else. She had hunger. Not the kind that comes from an empty stomach, but the kind that comes from knowing what it feels like to lose everything. She practiced longer than anyone else. She pushed herself harder than anyone expected. She played like her life depended on it, because for a long time, it had. Mrs. Chen came to every recital, every practice session, every small performance. She sat in the back of the room with her hands folded in her lap, watching Elena with eyes full of pride and something that looked like redemption. She was getting a second chance too. A chance to do for the daughter what she had failed to do for the mother. They talked about Anna often, usually late at night over cups of tea in Mrs. Chen's kitchen. Mrs. Chen shared stories from the old days, memories of a young girl with fire in her eyes and magic in her fingers. Elena shared stories too, about the mother she had known, the one who worked double shifts and still found time to play lullabies every night. Together, they pieced together a picture of a woman they had both loved, seeing her fully for the first time. One night, about 3 months in, Elena asked the question she had been holding inside since the beginning. "Do you think she would be proud of me?" Mrs. Chen had set down her teacup and looked at Elena with the most tender expression she had ever seen. "My dear girl," she said, "your mother is not just proud of you. She is with you. Every time you play, every note, every breath, she is right there beside you. That is the magic of music. It keeps the people we love alive, even when they are gone." Elena had cried that night, but for the first time in a long time. The tears felt healing instead of hurting. Now, standing backstage at the Symphony Hall, she could feel her mother's presence stronger than ever. It was in the weight of the violin against her shoulder. It was in the smell of the wood and the feel of the strings. It was in the beating of her own heart, which had once been a tiny flutter inside her mother's body. A stagehand appeared beside her. 2 minutes, Miss Vasquez." Elena nodded. She took a deep breath and looked down at her gown. It was deep blue, the color of the evening sky, and Mrs. Chen had bought it for her as a gift. It was the most beautiful thing Elena had ever worn. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the cold nights on the street, the hunger that had hollowed out her stomach, the restaurant manager who had tried to throw her out like garbage, the moment Mrs. Chen had stood up and said 2 simple words that changed everything. Let her play. Sometimes that was all anyone needed. Just a chance. Just one person willing to say yes when everyone else said no. The stagehand gestured toward the stage. "It's time." Elena walked toward the light. The applause started the moment she appeared. 2,000 people, clapping for her before she had even played a single note. She walked to the center of the stage, her legs steady even though her heart was racing. She found Mrs. Chen in the front row and saw the tears already streaming down the old woman's face. Then she saw someone else, a few rows back, sitting alone with his hands clasped nervously in his lap. It was the restaurant manager, the man who had called her a beggar and tried to have her thrown out into the cold. He had come to apologize a few weeks after that night. He had tracked down Mrs. Chen and asked for Elena's contact information. When they met for coffee, he had been a different person, humble, ashamed. He told her that watching her play had changed something inside him, that he had gone home that night and looked at himself in the mirror and didn't like what he saw. Elena had forgiven him. Not because he deserved it, but because holding on to anger would only poison her own heart. Her mother had taught her that too. Now he was here, watching her stand on the greatest stage in the city. She gave him a small nod, and he nodded back, his eyes glistening. Elena raised her violin to her shoulder. The hall fell silent. She thought about her mother, about Mrs. Chen, about every person who had ever looked through her, like she was invisible. She thought about the cold sidewalk outside that restaurant and the cardboard sign that had said, "Please let me play for food." She had come so far from that broken girl. But she was still the same person inside. Still her mother's daughter. Still fighting. Still hoping. Still believing that music could make miracles happen. She placed her bow against the strings, and then she began to play. The music filled the hall like sunlight flooding through an open window. It wrapped around every person in the audience and held them close. It spoke of pain and loss and loneliness, but also of hope and healing, and the stubborn refusal to give up. Elena played with everything she had. She played for her mother, who had sacrificed so much. She played for Mrs. Chen, who had given her a second chance. She played for every homeless person still sitting on cold sidewalks, invisible and forgotten, waiting for someone to see them. When the final note faded into silence, no one moved. Then Mrs. Chen stood up, just like she had that night in the restaurant. She began to clap, and the sound echoed through the hall like the first drop of rain before a storm. One by one, the audience rose to their feet. The applause grew louder and louder until it was thundering off the walls, filling every corner of the massive hall. People were crying. People were cheering. People were witnessing something they would tell their grandchildren about someday. Elena stood in the center of it all, tears streaming down her face. Her mother's violin clutched against her heart. She had been homeless. She had been hungry. She had been invisible. But she had never stopped playing. And in the end, that made all the difference.